September 1944. The Philippine island of Leyte lay shrouded in morning mist, its jungle canopy dripping with overnight rain as Private First Class Daniel Whitmore pressed his cheek against the worn wooden stock of his Springfield rifle. From his concealed position 40 feet above the jungle floor, wedged into the fork of a massive banyan tree, he could see nearly 300 yards in every direction through carefully cut gaps in the foliage. His breathing was slow, measured, almost imperceptible. He had been motionless for 6 hours, and he would remain motionless for 6 more if necessary. Somewhere in the dense vegetation below, enemy soldiers were preparing another assault on the American perimeter, and Daniel Whitmore was the only thing standing between them and the men he called brothers. What those enemy soldiers did not know, what they could not possibly have understood, was that the quiet young man from rural Montana had spent his entire childhood learning the one skill that would make him the most valuable asset in this corner of the Pacific Theater. They believed they were fighting against a conventional American force, one that would respond to their probing attacks with predictable firepower and movement. They were about to discover how wrong that assumption would prove to be. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. Over the next 7 days, Daniel Whitmore would transform from an unknown replacement soldier into a legend among his regiment, a figure whose silent patience and extraordinary marksmanship would neutralize 100 enemy combatants and fundamentally alter the tactical situation in his sector. This is the story of how one man's discipline, honed through years of wilderness survival, saved an entire company from potential annihilation and demonstrated that in the chaos of conflict, sometimes the quietest warriors prove the most decisive. Daniel Whitmore had arrived on Leyte just 3 weeks before that misty September morning, a 23-year-old replacement assigned to fill one of the many gaps in Baker Company, 2nd Battalion, 34th Infantry Regiment. His personnel file noted his civilian occupation as hunting guide, a designation that failed to capture the full scope of his abilities. Born and raised in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana, Daniel had been tracking and hunting game since before he could read. His father, a former Army scout who had served on the Mexican border, had taught him that patience was not merely a virtue, but a weapon more powerful than any firearm. The young Whitmore had taken his first elk at age 9, waiting motionless in a snow-covered blind for 14 hours until the massive bull wandered within range. By age 16, he was guiding wealthy eastern sportsmen through the wilderness, earning a reputation for always delivering results regardless of conditions. His clients marveled at his ability to remain perfectly still for entire days, his uncanny sense for predicting animal movements, and his almost supernatural accuracy with a rifle. What they did not understand was that these skills were not gifts but the product of relentless, deliberate practice spanning more than a decade. When the conflict began, Daniel had initially resisted enlistment, believing his skills would be wasted in the mass formations of conventional ground operations. It was not until 1943, when a visiting Army recruiter mentioned the development of specialized marksman programs, that he reconsidered. His qualification scores at training camp had been so exceptional that his instructors initially suspected some form of cheating. When supervised testing confirmed his abilities, he was fast-tracked through advanced training and designated as a precision marksman, one of only a handful in his entire division. Captain Robert Morrison, the commanding officer of Baker Company, had initially been skeptical of his new replacement. Morrison was a West Point graduate, a by-the-book officer who believed in firepower, movement, and aggressive action. The concept of a single soldier operating independently, selecting his own positions and targets, ran counter to everything he had been taught about unit cohesion and command authority. His opinion began to change on Daniel's 3rd day with the company. Baker Company had been tasked with establishing a defensive perimeter around a small village that controlled a crucial road junction. The enemy had been probing their lines for 2 days, launching small-scale assaults designed to identify weak points and test American resolve. On the morning of September 14th, Captain Morrison watched through binoculars as a group of approximately 20 enemy soldiers massed in a tree line 400 yards from his forward positions. Before he could order his machine gunners to open fire, He heard a single rifle report from somewhere behind him. 400 yards away, an enemy officer crumpled to the ground. Morrison swung his binoculars toward the source of the shot and found nothing but empty jungle. A second shot rang out, and a second figure fell, then a third. By the time the enemy soldiers scattered into deeper cover, 5 of them lay motionless on the jungle floor, and Morrison still had not identified the shooter. It was only when he returned to his command post that he found Private First Class Whitmore calmly cleaning his rifle, his face betraying no emotion whatsoever. The captain demanded an explanation. Daniel provided one in his characteristic sparse style. He had identified a natural shooting position in a damaged coconut palm approximately 200 yards behind the forward line. The position offered excellent sight lines to the most likely enemy assembly areas while remaining invisible from ground level. He had occupied the position before dawn, waited for targets to present themselves, and engaged when the opportunity arose. 5 rounds fired, 5 enemy combatants neutralized. Total elapsed time from first shot to last, 22 seconds. Morrison had read reports about specialized marksmen operating in the European theater, but he had never witnessed such precision firsthand. He asked Daniel what he needed to continue this work. The young man's response was simple and direct. He needed freedom to select his own positions, immunity from routine duties that would interfere with his observation schedule, and a reliable spotter to watch his back while he focused on targets. Morrison granted all 3 requests immediately. The spotter Daniel selected was Corporal Thomas Running Bear, a 26-year-old Lakota from the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Thomas had grown up hunting on the plains, developing his own set of wilderness skills that complemented Daniel's mountain expertise. More importantly, Thomas possessed the same capacity for stillness, the same ability to remain motionless for hours while maintaining perfect alertness. The 2 men had recognized each other as kindred spirits within hours of meeting, communicating in the abbreviated shorthand of those who understood that words were often unnecessary. On September 15th, Daniel and Thomas established their first coordinated position in a massive fig tree overlooking a river, crossing that enemy forces had been using for resupply. They arrived at 0300 hours, climbing the tree in complete darkness and settling into positions that would be invisible in daylight. Thomas carried a pair of captured binoculars and a notebook for recording observations. Daniel carried his Springfield 40 rounds of ammunition and 2 canteens of water. Neither man carried food. Eating created noise and movement, and both understood that noise and movement meant discovery, and discovery meant their mission would end. The first enemy soldiers appeared at 0645, a group of 8 moving in single file toward the crossing point. Daniel watched them through his rifle scope, tracking their movement, calculating range and windage in his head. He did not fire. The angle was poor, the light was uncertain, and taking a shot would reveal their position for minimal tactical gain. Patience was the foundation of everything. Wait for the right moment. Wait for the opportunity that justified the risk. That opportunity came at 0912, when a larger group of approximately 30 enemy soldiers emerged from the jungle on the far side of the river. Among them, Thomas identified through his binoculars what appeared to be a senior officer surrounded by several aides. The officer was studying a map, occasionally pointing toward the American positions and issuing instructions. This was not merely a target of opportunity. This was a target whose removal could disrupt enemy operations for days. Daniel made his calculations. Range, 320 yards. Wind, light and variable from the left. Humidity, high, which would slightly reduce bullet drop. Target, stationary but surrounded by others who would scatter at the first shot. He would have perhaps 3 seconds to engage before the entire group disappeared into cover. He breathed out slowly, settling his crosshairs on the officer's center mass. His finger tightened on the trigger with the gradual pressure his father had taught him 2 decades earlier. The rifle spoke. The officer fell. Before his aides could react, Daniel had worked the bolt and fired again, taking down a second figure who had frozen in shock. A third shot caught a soldier who was running in entirely the wrong direction, away from cover rather than toward it. The 4th and 5th rounds found their marks as well, and then the surviving enemy soldiers had vanished into the vegetation. leaving 5 of their comrades behind. Daniel and Thomas remained in position for another 6 hours, watching for any sign of a search party, but none materialized. The enemy apparently believed the attack had come from the American perimeter, not from a position deep in what they considered safe territory. That evening, Captain Morrison received a report from Division Intelligence. Enemy radio traffic indicated significant confusion in the sector, with multiple units reporting that their command structure had been disrupted by accurate American fire. The officer Daniel had targeted had been a battalion commander, a key figure in coordinating the ongoing probing attacks against American positions. With his removal, the enemy assaults became noticeably less organized, less coordinated, and less effective. September 16th brought rain, a steady tropical downpour that reduced visibility to less than 50 yards and turned every trail into a muddy stream. Most soldiers would have considered such conditions impossible for precision marksmanship. Daniel saw them as an opportunity. The enemy would believe themselves protected by the weather, would move with less caution, would present targets they would never risk exposing in clear conditions. He and Thomas occupied a position in a dense thicket overlooking a jungle path that intelligence had identified as a likely enemy supply route. The conditions were miserable beyond description. Rain poured through the canopy in sheets, soaking both men within minutes despite their ponchos. Insects swarmed around any exposed skin, biting and stinging with relentless persistence. The temperature hovered in the high 80s, creating a suffocating humidity that made every breath feel labored. Daniel ignored all of it. His focus narrowed to the path ahead, to the sight picture through his rain-spattered scope, to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat counting off the seconds. The first enemy supply party appeared at approximately 10:30, a group of 12 soldiers carrying ammunition and supplies toward the front lines. They moved carelessly, laughing and talking among themselves, confident that the rain shielded them from American observation. Daniel let them pass. His mission was not to harass supply lines, but to eliminate key personnel. Ammunition carriers, while important, could be easily replaced. Leaders could not. At 14:22, his patience was rewarded. A group of approximately 20 soldiers emerged from the jungle, and even through the rain, Thomas could identify the distinctive insignia of officers among them. These were not supply carriers. This was a command group moving forward to assess the tactical situation. Daniel counted 4 figures who appeared to be senior officers, surrounded by aides and guards. The range was shorter than yesterday, approximately 200 yards, but the rain created additional challenges. Water droplets could deflect bullets, alter trajectories in unpredictable ways. He would need to compensate. His first shot was slightly off target, striking an aide rather than the officer he had aimed for. But the bullet still found its mark, and chaos erupted among the enemy group. Daniel's second shot was perfect, dropping an officer who had unwisely remained standing while others dove for cover. The third and fourth shots caught soldiers who were attempting to locate the source of the firing, their confused movements making them easy targets. By the time the surviving enemy soldiers had organized themselves enough to retreat, 7 of their number remained motionless on the muddy path. That evening, as Daniel and Thomas finally returned to the American perimeter, after nearly 14 hours in position, they passed through a group of Marines from a neighboring unit who had heard about the mysterious marksman operating in the sector. One of them, a sergeant with campaign ribbons from 3 previous islands, approached Daniel and asked how many enemy soldiers he had accounted for. Daniel considered the question for a moment, then responded in his quiet Montana drawl that he did not keep count. Numbers were irrelevant. What mattered was whether his brothers were safer today than they had been yesterday. The sergeant nodded slowly, recognizing something in Daniel's eyes that transcended mere skill. This was a man who had found his purpose. Captain Morrison, however, did keep count. By the end of September 16th, his record showed that Private First Class Whitmore had confirmed neutralizations of 17 enemy combatants over 3 days of operations, including 2 officers of significant rank. More importantly, the character of enemy activity had shifted dramatically. The bold probing attacks of the first week had given way to cautious, tentative movements. Enemy soldiers no longer moved freely in daylight, no longer gathered in groups that made attractive targets. no longer assumed that distance from American lines meant safety. A single marksman had fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of the battlefield. September 17th brought clear skies and a new challenge. Division intelligence reported that the enemy was repositioning forces for a major assault, concentrating troops in a valley approximately 800 yards from the American perimeter. The terrain between the valley and the American positions was open ground, a natural field that would cost the enemy dearly if they attempted to cross it in force. But the assault would still come, and when it did, American casualties would be significant regardless of how many enemy soldiers fell. Captain Morrison asked Daniel if there was anything he could do to disrupt the enemy preparations before the assault materialized. Daniel studied the maps and aerial photographs for nearly an hour before responding. The valley where enemy forces were concentrating was beyond effective range for most shooting positions, but a ridge approximately 400 yards to the west offered possibilities. The approach to the ridge would be dangerous, requiring movement through territory that was technically behind enemy lines. But if he and Thomas could reach the position undetected, they would have clear sight lines into the concentration area. The range would be extreme, between 600 and 700 yards depending on target location, but Daniel had made shots at similar distances during his hunting days. He was willing to try. Captain Morrison hesitated. Sending 2 men into enemy territory for an operation of this nature violated every principle of conventional military tactics. If they were discovered, there would be no possibility of rescue, no support fire, no extraction. They would be entirely on their own. Daniel understood the risks and accepted them without complaint. Thomas Running Bear simply nodded when asked if he was willing to accompany his partner. Some missions were worth any risk, and this was one of them. They departed at 0200 on September 18th, moving through the jungle with the silent precision of the hunters they had been in their civilian lives. Every step was deliberate, every movement calculated to minimize noise and avoid disturbing the vegetation in ways that might reveal their passage. They crossed 2 enemy patrol routes by lying motionless in the undergrowth, while soldiers passed within yards of their position, so still that they were indistinguishable from the jungle floor. By 0530, they had reached the ridge and begun the careful process of establishing a concealed shooting position. The valley below was a revelation. Through his binoculars, Thomas counted approximately 200 enemy soldiers gathered in what appeared to be a staging area, with more arriving every few minutes. Supply crates were being distributed, equipment was being checked, and officers were moving among the troops delivering instructions. This was not merely a concentration of forces, this was the preparation for a major offensive, an assault that could potentially overwhelm the American defensive positions through sheer weight of numbers. And Daniel Whitmore was looking down on it from 400 yards away. He began his work at 0645, as the rising sun provided sufficient light for accurate shooting. His first target was an officer who was standing on an elevated platform, apparently addressing a gathered group of soldiers. The range was 620 yards, near the extreme limit of effective accuracy for his rifle, but the target was stationary and clearly visible. Daniel made his calculations, adjusted his aim for the distance and the slight crosswind, and fired. The officer fell. For a moment, the gathered soldiers below seemed confused, uncertain what had happened. Then Daniel fired again, and a second figure dropped. Panic erupted in the valley, as enemy soldiers realized they were under attack from an unseen position. Some dove for cover behind supply crates. Others ran in random directions, creating chaos that only made them more vulnerable. Daniel continued firing with mechanical precision, selecting targets, calculating adjustments, squeezing the trigger, working the bolt, selecting the next target. Each shot was deliberate, purposeful, effective. Thomas watched through his binoculars, calling out target locations and providing feedback on shot placement. His voice was calm, almost conversational, despite the magnitude of what they were accomplishing. Slight left, he would say. Target moving right to left, lead by 2 feet. Officer at the tree line, approximately 600 yards. Daniel processed each piece of information, incorporated it into his calculations, and continued his methodical work. By 0730, Daniel had fired 43 rounds and exhausted his ammunition supply. Thomas confirmed at least 27 visible neutralizations, with likely additional casualties among those who had managed to reach cover before succumbing to their injuries. More significantly, the entire enemy concentration had dispersed in panic, scattering into the jungle in complete disarray. The carefully planned assault had been disrupted before it could even begin, but now came the most dangerous part of the operation, the withdrawal through enemy territory with hostile forces on high alert. Daniel and Thomas descended from the ridge with infinite caution, moving even more slowly than they had during their approach. Every sound seemed magnified. Every movement of vegetation might conceal an enemy patrol searching for the marksman who had devastated their staging area. They moved by inches rather than feet, freezing at the slightest hint of danger, using every technique they had learned in their years of wilderness experience. At approximately 1100 hours, they encountered a four-man enemy patrol moving directly toward their position. There was no possibility of avoidance, no cover sufficient to conceal them if the patrol continued on its current path. Daniel exchanged a glance with Thomas, and both men understood what needed to happen. Daniel drew his sidearm, a .45 caliber pistol that had been his father's service weapon from the border campaigns, while Thomas unslung his carbine. They waited until the patrol was within 15 yards, then acted with the coordinated precision of men who had trained together for this exact scenario. The engagement lasted less than 3 seconds. When it was over, 4 enemy soldiers lay motionless on the jungle floor, and Daniel and Thomas were already moving, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the location before reinforcements could arrive. They reached American lines at 14:37, nearly 12 hours after their departure, exhausted but uninjured. Captain Morrison was waiting for them with a mixture of relief and amazement. Division intelligence had already intercepted enemy radio transmissions describing the chaos in the valley and ordering the postponement of all offensive operations until the situation could be assessed. The next 3 days followed a similar pattern. Each morning, Daniel and Thomas would occupy a new position overlooking likely enemy concentration areas or movement routes. Each day, they would wait with infinite patience for targets to present themselves. Each evening, they would return to American lines, having added to their growing tally of confirmed neutralizations. The enemy response evolved from confusion to fear to near paralysis. Soldiers who had once moved freely through their own rear areas now traveled only in darkness or under heavy escort. Officers who had once stood prominently to address their troops now remained hidden, communicating through messengers rather than risking exposure. A single marksman had accomplished what entire artillery batteries could not, breaking the enemy's will to operate normally. On September 21st, the 7th day of Daniel's campaign, the enemy attempted a coordinated response. Intelligence indicated that they had identified the general area from which the marksman attacks were originating and were positioning units to sweep the zone systematically. Captain Morrison offered to extract Daniel and Thomas from their forward position, but Daniel declined. Running would only confirm the enemy's suspicions about his operating area. The better approach was to remain in place, let the sweep pass, and then continue operations from a position they had already searched and dismissed as clear. The decision nearly cost both men their lives. At approximately 0900, an enemy squad conducting the sweep passed within 10 feet of Daniel's concealed position in a dense stand of bamboo. For 23 minutes, enemy soldiers searched the immediate area, poking into likely hiding spots, examining the ground for signs of recent occupation. Daniel and Thomas lay motionless beneath their camouflage, barely breathing, willing themselves into absolute stillness, while hostile forces moved close enough to touch. At one point, an enemy soldier actually sat down on a log directly above Thomas's position, taking a break from the search while his companions continued checking the area. Thomas could have reached up and touched the man's boot. He did not move a muscle. Eventually, the squad moved on, satisfied that the area was clear. Daniel waited another 2 hours before allowing himself to shift position, knowing that the enemy might have left observers behind to watch for movement. When he finally raised his scope to survey the terrain, he found a gift he had not expected. A group of enemy officers had gathered approximately 300 yards away, apparently confident that the sweep had secured the area. They were examining maps, pointing toward American positions, planning their next move. Daniel counted 7 figures in the group, at least 3 of whom wore the insignia of senior rank. He engaged with the cold efficiency that had become his trademark over the past week. 7 shots, 7 targets neutralized. By the time enemy soldiers from the sweep responded to the sound of firing, Daniel and Thomas had already displaced to a secondary position 200 yards away. From there, Daniel added 4 more to his tally as enemy soldiers carelessly exposed themselves while attempting to locate the source of the initial attack. The sweep that had been intended to eliminate the American marksman instead provided him with his most productive single engagement of the entire campaign. By the evening of September 21st, Daniel Whitmore had confirmed neutralizations of exactly 100 enemy combatants over 7 days of continuous operations. The number itself was remarkable, but the strategic impact far exceeded what any simple count could convey. Enemy operations in the sector had effectively ceased. Assault preparations had been abandoned. Movement was restricted to absolute necessities conducted under cover of darkness. Morale among enemy forces had collapsed to the point where soldiers were reportedly refusing orders that required exposure during daylight hours. A single man with a rifle had accomplished what an entire regiment might have struggled to achieve. Captain Morrison submitted a detailed report to Division Headquarters that evening, recommending Private First Class Whitmore for the Distinguished Service Cross, and requesting that he be formally designated as the battalion's precision marksman with expanded authority to operate independently. The recommendation was approved within 24 hours, and similar marksman programs were established across the division based on the success of Daniel's operations. The concept of the individual precision marksman, operating with patience and skill to shape the battlefield through targeted eliminations, had been validated in the most convincing possible manner. But for Daniel himself, the numbers and the recognition meant little. When asked about his accomplishments by a correspondent who visited the company position several weeks later, he deflected the questions with characteristic modesty. He was not a hero, he said. He was simply a hunter who happened to be hunting in a conflict zone rather than the mountains of Montana. The skills were the same. The patience was the same. The only difference was that the stakes were measured in human lives rather than filled tags and successful seasons. What Daniel did not say, what he could not articulate even to himself, was how the experience had changed him. Every shot he had taken over those 7 days had been necessary, justified, purposeful. Every enemy soldier he had neutralized had been preparing to attack his brothers, to take American lives, to advance an agenda that threatened everything Daniel held dear. He felt no guilt for his actions, no remorse for the lives he had affected, but he also felt no pride, no satisfaction, no pleasure. Each shot had been a job, a task, a duty fulfilled. Nothing more. Thomas Running Bear understood, perhaps better than anyone else could have. The Lakota tradition of the warrior acknowledged that taking action against an enemy, even necessary action, carried a spiritual weight that could not be ignored. In the weeks following their campaign, Thomas led Daniel through a series of quiet ceremonies, adapted from his people's traditions, but relevant to any warrior who had done what they had done. They spoke of the men they had faced, acknowledged their humanity, and released the burden of their actions to the wind and the sky. It was not absolution exactly, but it was peace of a kind that military chaplains and psychological evaluations could never provide. The tactical situation on Leyte continued to evolve over the following months. American forces expanded their perimeter, secured their objectives, and eventually achieved complete control of the island. Daniel Whitmore continued his operations throughout, adapting his techniques to new terrain and new challenges, training other soldiers in the principles of patience and precision that had served him so well. By the time the campaign concluded, he had accumulated a record that would stand as one of the most impressive individual achievements of the entire Pacific Theater. But the story that mattered most to Daniel was not about numbers or records. It was about the men of Baker Company who survived because of his work, the brothers who went home to families and futures that might have been cut short without his intervention. Years later, at reunion gatherings where veterans shared memories of their service, Daniel would sit quietly in the corner, while others told stories of his exploits. He had done what was necessary. His brothers were alive. That was enough. The lessons of those 7 days in September 1944 resonated far beyond the immediate tactical context. Military theorists studied Daniel's campaign as a case study in the psychological impact of precision operations. Training programs incorporated his techniques, his emphasis on patience, his understanding that a single well-placed shot could accomplish more than 1,000 rounds of suppressive fire. The modern concept of the specialized marksman, the precision asset operating with independence and discretion to shape the battlefield, traces its lineage directly to men like Daniel Whitmore, who proved the concept in the crucible of actual experience. Thomas Running Bear returned to Pine Ridge after the conflict concluded, where he lived a long and fulfilling life as a teacher and spiritual leader in his community. He never spoke publicly about his service, but those who knew him understood that his time with Daniel had shaped him in ways that transcended ordinary experience. He had witnessed patience transformed into power, discipline converted into decisive action. These lessons informed his teaching, his guidance, his understanding of what humans were capable of when they committed themselves fully to a purpose. Daniel Whitmore went back to Montana, to the mountains and valleys where he had learned the skills that saved so many lives. He resumed his work as a hunting guide, leading clients through wilderness that seemed somehow smaller and more manageable after what he had experienced in the Pacific. He married a woman he had known since childhood, raised 3 sons and 2 daughters, and lived to see grandchildren who could scarcely imagine the world their grandfather had helped preserve. He never spoke of his service except in the most general terms, and he never displayed the medals that gathered dust in a drawer of his study. When he passed away in 1997 at the age of 76, his obituary mentioned only that he had served with distinction in the Pacific Theater. The full story of those 7 days remained locked in classified files and fading memories. But the men he had saved, and the families they had built in the decades since the conflict ended, stood as living testaments to what one man could accomplish through patience, skill, and an unwavering commitment to protecting those who depended on him. The jungle of Leyte has long since reclaimed the positions where Daniel Whitmore once lay motionless for hours, waiting for the perfect shot. The banyan trees and fig trees that served as his platforms have grown and changed, their branches reaching toward a sky that no longer echoes with the sound of distant operations. The paths where enemy soldiers once walked in fear of an unseen marksman are now peaceful trails through protected forest, visited by tourists who have no conception of the history beneath their feet. But in the archives of military history, in the memories of those who served alongside him, and in the continued study of his techniques by those who train the precision marksmen of today, Daniel Whitmore's legacy endures. He proved that in the chaos and confusion of large-scale conflict, individual excellence still matters. He demonstrated that patience, properly applied, is the most powerful asset any soldier can possess, and he showed that the quiet professionals, the men who do their duty without seeking recognition or glory, are often the ones who make the greatest difference when the stakes are highest. His story is not one of dramatic heroics or theatrical courage. It is something more subtle and perhaps more valuable, a testament to the power of preparation, the importance of discipline, and the profound impact that one dedicated individual can have on the course of events. In an age of mechanized conflict and mass formations, Daniel Whitmore reminded everyone who witnessed his work that outcomes are still determined by people, by their skills and their character, and their willingness to do whatever is necessary to protect those they love. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.